Hello and welcome to the Ocean News Podcast, an audio series taking you through the biggest stories in the breaking news from the Oceanographic newsroom. I'm Rob Hutchins, news editor here at Oceanographic magazine, and in this episode, I'll be taking a deeper dive into a story closer to home for us here in the newsroom, as we look into the findings linking the rise in ocean temperatures and the persistence of a harmful chemical banned back in the 1980s, with the spread of infectious disease and even increased risk of death among dolphins across the UK coastline. Yes, today's headline is a story of legacy impact from the mistakes made in decades gone by, and the lessons we simply have to learn from them to provide a better future for life in the ocean today. So let's start at the beginning. New research published this week has linked the persistence of chemicals banned back in the 80s alongside rising ocean temperatures, with the increased pressures being faced by populations of short-beaked common dolphins across the UK, now found to be at an increased risk of death perpetuated by the spread of infectious disease. The study has been compiled by the Cetacean Strandings Investigation Programme at the Zoological Society of London and the Scottish Marine Animal Stranding Scheme at the University of Glasgow, and it sheds new light on the dramatic impact being felt at the hands of both climate change and environmental pollution upon marine mammals here in the UK. To help us get a better understanding of the subject, who better to talk us through it than the report's author herself, Dr. Rosie Williams, a postdoctoral research assistant at the Zoological Society of London. Rosie, thank you so much for joining us here on the Ocean News Podcast. It's a pleasure to talk with you. I just wish it was under better circumstances because this is actually quite the hard-hitting and impactful study, isn't it? So I'll start right from the top of things and ask if you can tell us just what this study was. What have we found?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work for a stranding scheme based in the UK, so the Cetacean Stranding Investigation Programme. And so using that data, we looked at causes of death in common dolphins that have stranded around the UK coast from 1990 to 2021. And anecdotally, we'd seen a bit of an increase in animals that were stranding that had died from infectious disease. And so we wanted to dive a little bit more into that data to try and understand what some of the causes might be. And obviously, we know there are lots of threats in the environment these animals face, two of which are part of the triple planetary crisis, so pollution, climate change, and biodiversity loss. So we were interested in having a look to see if we could find any signals from things like climate change or pollution that might be linked to this increase in infectious disease that we saw. So the way that we were able to do that is with the strandings data that we have a really valuable data set of pollution concentrations in these animals. So to the best of our knowledge, it's the biggest in the world in terms of looking at toxicology in these animals. And so we were able to look at the pollution concentrations in the animals that had died from infectious disease and compare those with the animals that had died from other causes of death. So things like trauma, like ship strike or bycatch being caught in fishing gear. And we found this association whereby animals that had died from infectious disease, and they had this link with their concentrations of pollution in their body. So their risk of dying from infectious disease was increased the more pollution that they had in their body.
Right, which is a pretty, if not unexpected finding, hard hitting all the same, isn't it? But this is only part of the study, isn't it? Because you were also looking at the impact of rising ocean temperature having the same effect.
So you can imagine there's probably lots and lots of different mechanisms that might be at play when we're looking at impacts from climate change. So just as a very initial look and see, is there a signal? We looked at sea surface temperature. We looked at mean sea surface temperature in the months that the animals are stranded and to see if there was any link again with infectious disease. Mm-hmm. And again, we found that when there were increased sea surface temperatures, we found this link where there was an increased risk of dying from infectious disease. I just want to mention again about the mechanisms beyond that. So we're not necessarily saying it's a direct link between sea surface temperature and death from disease. There might be lots of other things at play there, things like changes in prey distribution, changes in pathogens, changes in virulence of those pathogens, novel pathogens through habitat change. So there's lots of different explanations for that. But we did find that these two threats that are often studied in isolation are actually having this sort of compounding impact in terms of risk of infectious disease in common dolphins in the UK.
what areas were these? These are waters sort of, was it near industrialized coasts? I think I read that.
Yeah, so we're looking all around the UK.
Yeah.
They tend to have these clusters of distribution. So we see quite a lot of strandings traditionally around the southwest coast of the UK. In this work and previous work, we've also looked at spatial trends of pollution. And again, because we have such a large sample size, we're able to look at how those pollutants spatially distribute in these animals. And we do tend to find that for specific pollutants, the ones that we looked at are called PCBs or polychlorinated biphenyls, we find higher concentrations where there are greater levels of industrialization. And that's sort of what you'd expect. And that exists on a UK-wide level where we see higher levels in England and Wales than we do in Scotland. But you also see that globally. But there is this phenomenon known as atmospheric transport, where these concentrations, where these pollutants move from areas of high concentrations to low concentrations. So where you might traditionally have had higher levels around industrialized areas, we're now seeing this atmospheric transport to the poles, which is quite concerning because those are pristine environments.
Oh, wow. So it's got reverberations like globally then. What we see here is just like a microcosm of what could be going on around the world.
Absolutely. And when these chemicals were banned, we initially saw this sharp decrease in England and Wales that corresponded with an increase in Scotland, again, which we think is this evidence of atmospheric transport, where actually those pollutants were shifting to higher latitudes and areas of lower concentration. So
right, because these were chemicals banned in the 80s, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that's why I think they're a really important lesson for today, because we still have lots of these chemicals stockpiled. They're really expensive and difficult to get rid of. So there's still a huge amount of work to be done to make sure that we're protecting the environment from these chemicals, despite the fact that they've already been banned. They still exist in some pieces of equipment and they're stockpiled, as I said. But we have lots and lots of chemicals that show similar profiles in terms of toxicities and persistence and ability to transport, such as PFASs, which are talked a lot about at the moment. But we haven't yet banned them. And so, we're looking at 40 to 50 years down the line with these chemicals that when they were banned. But we've got similar chemicals that we haven't yet regulated properly. So I think it's really important to try and learn from these mistakes of the past so that we can have better regulation and be more proactive than reactive in the chemical space.
Okay, so super critical findings that you've made here then in relation to those legacy chemicals with lots of lessons to take forward. Just for some extra context, what are and where are we finding these PFAs right now?
So PFAS, they have a huge number of uses. So there's lots and lots of different ways that they're getting into the environment. So they're in things like your non-stick pans, they're in a lot of waterproof clothing, they're in sort of takeaway food contact materials, lots and lots of consumer products, because this is often what happens is with these chemicals, they're often really, really useful. And because of that, they become ubiquitous. Chemical industry protects against being able to manufacture because they're making lots and lots of money from these useful chemicals. And then we just lag so far behind in having the proper regulation.
Yeah. Oh, it must be so frustrating.
It is. And I think the lack of consumer choice and public awareness as well, I think, is a really big problem. So there's so many things that are sprayed in persistent and toxic chemicals, right? There just are. Flame retardants are one piece. And you can't, there's not a label that tells you what chemical something's been sprayed with. And there's not really a choice of this has been sprayed with this concentration. It's very difficult for us as consumers to make decisions about, to even just reduce our own risk of what we're being exposed to.
Oh, I know. Yeah, but I mean, you can take that argument goes across everything, like plastics, and it's such an infrastructure issue that has such a wide impact across the ecosystem that it's just such a tricky subject to whittle down to just one solution. Okay, so talking about the second part of the study, the sea temperature rises, there's some shocking findings here too. So why is this study so critical right now?
So I think there are a few reasons why this is a really important study right now. I think we've got this amazing population of common dolphins that we're seeing increases in strandings, we're seeing increases in infectious disease. It's really important to protect them, and we need to understand what the threats that they face are so that we can mitigate against them. The other aspect is that we've traditionally often looked at threats in isolation. So we have a bunch of people looking at bycatch. We have a bunch of people looking at impacts from pollution and a bunch of other people looking at climate change. And it's really important to account for the interconnected nature of a lot of these threats.
Hmm.
And this is sort of the first time we've tried to do this. And there's a lot more that can be done with bringing in other threats, such as bycatch, which we know is a big issue for these animals too. But I think it's just really highlighting that we can't sort of regulate and think about these things in isolation because they often have these sort of synergistic effects.
And what's the message that you'd like to be taken away from this?
So I think when we talk about the chemical pollution piece, it's just so important to get the regulation right. We still have a lot to do in terms of making sure that we adequately dispose of these PCBs that have already been banned. But I think when we're talking about real action that we can take today, it's to make sure that we're sort of leading the charge and protecting against chemicals that we know are similar. So the PFAS that I mentioned, France have agreed to ban those in 2026 for all but non-essential uses. The UK are really far behind in that space. And I think the breakaway from the EU has a big part to play in that. We've been promised a new chemical strategy since 2020 and we're yet to see it. So I think we are falling behind and we need to make sure that isn't the case because these chemicals are so expensive and costly and take such a long time to clear up. And then in terms of the climate piece, I think it just illustrates how little we know about what some of the impacts might be on these animals. It's not necessarily intuitive that a sea surface temperature rise would have this impact in common dolphins because they're traditionally a warm water species. And so I think it just highlights that we need to know a lot more about what the impacts might be. But until we do, we just really need to make sure that we're reducing the impacts of climate change and trying to minimize this carbon that we're producing.
No, absolutely. So at the risk of asking a tricky question then, who is it that needs to be taking responsibility for all this?
I think the people with the most responsibility are the politicians here. They need to push to be competitive. I mean, we need to not be the last people to regulate properly against chemicals that we know are dangerous. The same goes for PCBs. We have commitments under an agreement, a multilateral agreement called the Stockholm Convention. We have commitments that are due 2025 and 2028. And the last time I checked, we were not on track to meet those commitments to the convention. So I think just the minimum that we can do is meet the targets that we've set in these international treaties and not fall behind other countries in terms of our chemical regulation. And then from a consumer point of view, it's the decisions that you make when you're shopping and buying things and the products that you're using.
Okay, so great. Well, we know the issues then, we know the lessons that we've got to learn. So let me ask you, what keeps you hopeful? Is there reason to stay hopeful? What have we seen in the past that we can take that from?
We have, as much as we've made mistakes in the past, we've also done brilliant things in the past. When you look at other chemicals that we've regulated against that used to be a problem in these animals, you see these lovely correlations where you see a ban come into place and then you see this really sharp decline. And there are lots of chemicals that we used to test for in these animals to see what threats they face that we don't need to test for anymore because we know they're not a problem. So we have managed to do this in the past. These animals and the environment can recover quickly. We just need to do the right thing at the right time.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. Thank you. That was a great answer to a horrible question. So thanks for putting that out of the bag. So what's next for you then in terms of, are you taking this study further?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I continued, my main research interests are looking at the impacts of sort of human threats on marine predators. So I'm continuing to look at chemical pollution in these animals, at different marine mammal species to understand what's going on. We're interested in looking a bit at distribution changes in these animals that might be a consequence of climate change. So there's lots to be done. We're interested in looking at heavy metals as well, because they're another type of pollutant that we haven't looked at in around 20 years, just to see what's happening, because there have been other papers that have reported increases in wildlife of heavy metals. So there's lots still to look at and try and understand. And I think the Strandings program that I'm part of provides this fantastic opportunity to be able to understand what's happening with these animals in the wild by looking sort of at long-term causes of death over space and time.
Well, best of luck with all the future endeavors and the future research. And I know it's a weird one to say, congratulations on bringing this to light, but I guess, congratulations on
Thank you. Yeah.
to light. And hopefully it makes that sort of, brings that message to a wider audience and actually makes some step changes in towards actually making a difference and getting things done. And thank you again. To learn more about this study or other studies on pollution and chemicals in the marine environment, head to the Oceanographic Newsroom. This has been the Ocean News Podcast. I've been Rob Hutchins. Thank you for listening.